I'm going to start, first of all, with a little bit of the history of the high-speed rail in Florida. It mainly started in 2000 when the voters approved an amendment to the Florida Constitution that called for the development of a high-speed rail to link the 5 largest cities in Florida as determined by the legislature. The $1.25 billion of federal funding dedicated to the Central Florida rail portion of the high-speed rail project and the additional $1.1 billion requested to complete the line will not bring the rail system over to Pinellas County. It will not connect the Orlando tourists to our beaches, connect our most densely populated county, and the 4th largest cities to the other 5 areas originally designated.
The state has requested an additional $1.1 billion in funding that would basically pay for the bulk of the construction of the system. It is helped that the state owns the right-of-way on I-4. Construction will begin this fall. There are folks out there working already. Selection of a private consortium starts next year, and to some extent that depends on how successful the state is in getting additional funding. That will define how much the private sector is really responsible for. High-speed rail around the world was created really for the 100 to 500 mile market. Ideally, high-speed rail around the world replaces your short-haul air market. Again, your 100 to 500 mile. That is ultimately the least efficient form of transportation out there right now. The short-haul air flights consume an immense amount of energy and an immense amount of environmental resources. High-speed rail tends to be hourly or half-hourly service. It is not every 10 minutes or every 3 minutes. There are systems that work that way simply because of the number of people that need to move. In Japan, some of the frequencies are very, very often. But ideally, what you're trying to move is the business market. The key is that for most of our systems, and particularly the one in Florida, the goal is unsubsidized fares. And that's really a very important element. Transit, as most of you know, is heavily subsidized. Some systems are more efficient than others, but the idea is to get people out of their cars and onto public transit. So the goal there is to maximize the ridership of the system. High-speed rail is very fast. It's powered electrically. Right now, the Europeans and the Asians are going at top speed of 220 miles per hour. I think eventually we'll hit about 250, and I'm not sure it will go much faster than that. It uses a fraction of the fuel of airplanes. It uses a fraction of generates a fraction of the pollutants, particularly carbon, of an automobile or airplanes. So with an electrified train, is when you apply the brakes, it actually generates, they don't use brakes, it's kind of like downshifting your car. It runs gears that put the energy right back into the system. Even a Acela puts back between 30 and 40% of the electricity it otherwise uses by slowing down. So it's why it generates such positive energy statistics. And on the air quality, because it's electrical, it's not generating any air quality issues at the train itself. It does at the power plant, but it's much easier to control emissions at the power plant than it is in terms of your individual car or the fuel that's taken for takeoff and landing. We essentially had no high-speed rail system other than Amtrak, for better or for worse, until 2 years ago when President Obama announced his high-speed rail initiative. So far, there's been about $10.5 billion provided for high-speed rail. Florida was very fortunate to get $1.25 billion of that. It has applied for additional funding in this next round that gets announced in about 3 weeks. The Federal Railroad Administration is the lead agency. For many of us in the transit and transportation world, that is a different agency than we're used to working with. The Federal Railroad Administration's created a process called a Service Development Plan, which really lays out all of the requirements for high-speed rail, how your system will operate, who it's going to serve, why you're serving it, what the rationale is, and why you should get funding for it. The high-speed rail system we have 10 official corridors plus the Northeast Corridor. They actually are in the right place. In most cases, politics always plays a role in this. But one of the interesting elements is to look at a nighttime shot of the United States, and frankly, the high-speed rail corridors align pretty much where the lights are. The challenge for us in the States is to try to understand why high-speed rail is so successful everywhere else, but has really found limited implementation in the United States. For the most part, there's a national funding partner. We finally have one in the United States, albeit at a relatively low amount of money. But in France, in Japan, in China, these are all being driven by the federal government. What has hurt Florida in all of its efforts to implement high-speed rail is the federal government was never there. It finally is, so that's a big change. Europe and Asia do not dispute global warming and the fact that there is an environmental crisis out there. We are still, in many areas of this country, still debating that issue. And until that issue gets resolved, it's hard to have a national consensus that we need to do something about it. Florida could have the first high-speed rail system in the country, but the reality is you have some great markets in the state. You have folks that rely on transportation. You have millions of folks flying into Miami who are forced to rent a car for no purpose other than to get to Central Florida. And so in a sense, by not having a public transportation system, we are forcing people onto our roads. And that makes it very difficult for those that live here and want to share those roads. The goal is Tampa, Orlando right now for the segment that's gone through the environmental phasing. In about 50 minutes, Miami, Orlando in 2 hours. It's faster, stress-free. You might fly, but chances are you'll take the train. It's just how people think, and I think ultimately Florida probably needs to get there, given the inability of the roads to keep up with the congestion that keeps flooding them. Right now, that system, as defined by the Federal Railroad Administration and the state, is Tampa to Orlando. We are working on Miami, Orlando. There is a request for funding that we should hear in about 3 weeks on that would really kick that off. Miami, Orlando is a critical element of this system because it's 230 miles. That is actually where high-speed rail can achieve its highest speed, get its biggest market, and from a concession perspective, generate probably the greatest revenues.
The one thing, and this is probably public speaking 101, don't ever do, the one thing I'm not going to talk about is the problem. I want to talk about the FTA process because it's different than what the federal highway model is, and it's different than the way FRA is going to go with their funding programs. FTA has what's called the New Starts program. I won't bore you with the details of that, but it's a very intricate process that you go through to develop and evaluate your alternatives with a couple of key milestones that are in it. The last milestone is truly an act of Congress because it's a discretionary program. Once you get your project through the local planning process, designed and ready to go, it truly is an act of Congress to say, there's your funding, good luck. Now, there's certain criteria that are important when you're developing and evaluating what's going on with your transportation projects. And I purposefully put this transit supportive land use one up here because of what's changing in the review and evaluation process as you go to. Certainly ridership is important. Cost effectiveness is important. What does it cost to build the system, to own, to operate and maintain and pay those annual bills associated with that? Efficiencies, environmental benefits associated with some of the efficiencies that Dave was talking about earlier, highlighting what's going on with hybrid electric systems on the bus services, and then your local financial commitment. The first part right there that I want to highlight is called the preliminary engineering environmental impact point. That is a milestone where you actually have to receive federal approval to proceed. It's a gatekeeper point by FTA for your projects. The last one, of course, down there is what's called the full funding grant agreement. That's when you're given the money to build the project. So FTA doesn't even like you to get into their game unless you have a legitimate project that you can move forward. I know Federal Highway is similar in terms of how they look at the things as well on the highway side, but FTA is pretty strict on that. So why is public transportation important? Handful of factors, not the least of which the global warming, oil consumption and how kind of selfish we are as a country on those factors, air quality, land use, how are we making the best use of the precious resources that we have, economic development, opportunities for jobs, not just to implement some of the things that we would see here, but then the sustainable jobs and those things around the station areas and those opportunities for growth, and then certainly quality of life.